Sydney, 2013. A city of glittering harbors, neon nightlife, and a quiet promise that nothing truly dangerous happens behind its manicured streets. But promises lie, because tucked behind the laughter of crowded bars and the shuffle of late-night taxis, one apartment will become a coffin. Inside, the scene was deceptively ordinary. A bed unmade, clothes on the floor, the faint smell of spilled alcohol. Ordinary until you saw him. A young man, 20-something, cut down in the place he should have felt safest. No forced entry, no warning signs, just silence, and the kind of stillness that makes your stomach turn cold. The newspapers would later call a random act, a tragic break in the fabric of city life. But when police trace the night backward, through surveillance footage, text messages, and whispers of a stranger's face, something unsettling surfaced. The figure at the center of it all didn't look like a predator. He didn't even look old enough to drive. They called him the baby face killer. And the story that followed would rattle Sydney into asking a question it wasn't ready to answer. How do you recognize evil when it wears the face of a child? It was written in blue ink, the handwriting rounded, childish, like something pulled from a school notebook, not a confession to something unspeakable. The diary page read, "I didn't mean to do it, but once I started, I couldn't stop. I liked the way it felt." Investigators never forgot that scrap of paper. It wasn't found neatly in a journal, but crumpled in a shoebox, tucked under clothes that still smelled of cheap detergent. It didn't even have a name sign at the bottom, just jagged lines that trailed off like the writer lost interest mid-thought. And yet, the words felt alive, thrumming with a menace that couldn't be ignored. The words took on a grotesque second life when linked to the body of a young man, Morgan Huxley, discovered in his apartment on a Sunday morning in 2013. He was just 31 years old, a man who'd left the bar hours before, unaware that someone was watching him. Someone who looked disarmingly young, with a face people described as soft, almost sweet. That face would earn its owner a name whispered like a ghost story, the baby face killer. Imagine the contradiction. A man who looked barely old enough to order a drink, yet was capable of something so cold, so deliberate, it silenced an entire neighborhood. Witnesses would later describe him in contradictions. Gentle voice, childish grin, movements too calculated for his years. It was as if innocence had been skinned and worn like a mask. The case didn't open with clarity. It opened with whispers, broken timelines, and a city unwilling to believe that evil could look so harmless. The diary page was never officially tied to the crime, but it fit too well, like a puzzle piece someone tried to force into the wrong box. Too juvenile to ignore, too specific to dismiss. Morgan's death wasn't the kind that left clean edges. The scene was chaotic. Overturned furniture, streaks of blood that suggested struggle, a door left ajar as if someone couldn't decide whether to flee or linger. The neighbors reported nothing unusual until it was too late. The city, Sydney, had seen its share of violence, but this one cut deeper, because it felt random, senseless, and carried out by a face that didn't belong in police mugshots, but in high school yearbooks. So the question lingered, looping endlessly in investigators' minds and in the city's hushed conversations. How does someone with eyes that still look like they hadn't finished growing up transform into a predator? Was this premeditated or the chaotic birth of impulse? And most of all, what did Morgan see in his last moments when he looked into that deceptively young face? The diary page, the overturned room, the empty street outside, they all told pieces of the story too fractured to believe. But in the cracks, a pattern began to take shape. Sydney, 2013. The harbor glittered the way it always did. Postcard perfect, drunk on its own beauty, selling the illusion that nothing rotten could ever fester behind the skyline. Darling Harbor hosted tourists snapping photos. Bondi was its usual sunburnt circus, and North Shore suburbs whispered the quiet arrogance of money. But just a short walk away from the polished veneers, The nights were different. Pubs overflowed with sweat and beer, and alleyways hummed with a mixture of laughter, vomit, and deals best left unrecorded. Morgan Huxley lived in Neutral Bay, a suburb that pretended to be tame but pulsed with late-night temptation. It was a liminal space, not as glamorous as the CBD, not as lawless as King's Cross. A place where respectable families lived alongside drifting singles and the after-hours economy. The streets were narrow, dimly lit, and built for secrets. When you walked them after midnight, every shadow seemed to have a mouth, waiting to swallow you whole. Australia in the early 2010s wasn't exactly brimming with fear. The news obsessed over celebrity scandals, corrupt politicians, and rugby scores. But under that facade was something harder to pin down. An anxiety about youth, about masculinity, about what happens when young men who've grown up on a diet of screens, cheap alcohol, and fractured families step into a world unprepared. The baby-faced predator didn't emerge from nowhere. He was the ugly mirror of a culture that liked to laugh off violence until the laughter stopped. Neutral Bay itself was deceptive. On one hand, yachts, cafes, waterside views. On the other, pubs where the carpet clung to decades of spilled beer and the air smelled like sweat and despair. These pubs attracted a mixed crowd, men and women finishing their work week, kids too young to legally drink sneaking in with fake IDs, loners lurking at the edges. It was in this ecosystem, this half-polite, half-feral suburb, that Morgan spent his last night alive. And Sydney had a curfew of its own kind, the kind nobody talks about until someone breaks it. Walk home too late. Trust the wrong stranger. Invite someone in without checking their intentions. And the city revealed teeth you didn't know it had. This wasn't Jack the Ripper's London. It wasn't Al Capone's Chicago. It was something more unsettling. The modern world dressed in comfort, pretending it had evolved past danger. Yet danger didn't care about skyscrapers or iPhones. It needed only one person, one moment, one apartment door left unlocked. The stage was set not in a Gothic alley, but in a modern city that swore it was safe. And maybe that's what made it all worse. Because when something monstrous happens in a place you thought was civilized, it doesn't just end a life. It punctures the illusion that civilization was ever real. Morgan Huxley wasn't supposed to be remembered like this. He was supposed to be one of those men who quietly orbit their neighborhoods. Friendly, familiar, never controversial. 31 years old. A man who carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything. His friends described him as dependable, easy to laugh with, the kind of man you'd trust with your spare house key or to walk you home after a late night. He worked in construction and design, a trade that left calluses on his hands but never hardened his personality. He played guitar, not to impress anyone, but because music gave him a private kind of oxygen. When he stepped into a pub, bartenders knew him by name. He was neither a saint nor a rebel, just one of those people who seemed permanently at ease in their own skin. And that might have been his fatal flaw, his openness. Morgan was social, approachable, the kind of man who didn't see strangers as threats, but as potential companions. The city at night was his playground, not a place of fear. That Saturday evening in September 2013, he was out drinking, talking, doing what countless others were doing. It was ordinary, unremarkable, until it wasn't. The world tended to categorize people like Morgan in two ways. Either as faceless victims whose names fade quickly, or as saints immortalized by their tragedy. But the truth is less convenient. He was a man who loved his friends, loved his guitar, loved the feeling of a warm night carrying him home. He wasn't naive, but he wasn't paranoid either. He didn't live in a world where someone with a baby face could also carry a monstrous impulse. Those who knew him still talk about his eyes, how they seemed to smile even when his mouth didn't. You don't forget eyes like that. They don't belong in a police report or a coroner's file. They belong in the memory of late-night conversations, and the echo of someone saying, "He was just a good bloke." It's a cruel kind of poetry. Then that Morgan's openness, the very trait that made him loved, was the same trait that may have made him vulnerable. Because when he left the bar and returned to his apartment, he wasn't alone. Someone had followed him. Someone who looked like they should have been worrying about homework, not hunting. Someone with a face that said innocent, but hands that said otherwise. The clash between those two lives, Morgan's steady, good-hearted existence, and the stranger's hungry, restless one, was about to write a story that Sydney would never shake off. It started with a shadow that didn't belong. Morgan left the Ivory Lounge, the kind of bar that thrives on dim lighting and overpriced cocktails. Sometime after 2 a.m. CCTV caught him weaving his way down Military Road. Nothing unusual in his step. What the cameras also caught, but no one noticed until later, was another figure trailing behind. Slighter, quieter, moving with a strange mix of hesitation and purpose, like a child daring themselves into a haunted house. That figure was 18-year-old Jack Kelsall. If you'd seen him on the street, you might have mistaken him for a teenager waiting for the bus, face still soft with youth, hair falling into his eyes. But there was something off if you looked closer. He didn't walk like other kids. He walked like he was rehearsing, like every step was part of a plan only he understood. Morgan, perhaps sensing nothing, went home. His apartment on Grosvenor Street wasn't far, a short stumble, the kind of walk countless young men made without a second thought. His door wasn't fortress-like. It was just an ordinary apartment door, meant to keep out the cold more than intruders. The disturbance came not with a bang, not even with a scream, but with a quiet, insidious act of letting someone in. Whether Morgan invited Jack in, or whether Jack slipped through behind him, remains contested, blurred by theories and speculation. But what is certain is that inside that apartment, the balance shifted. Furniture shifted violently. Blood marked the carpet. Signs of struggle were everywhere. Evidence that Morgan realized too late that the harmless face in front of him was anything but. Imagine betrayal of that moment. A stranger, barely old enough to shave, suddenly lunging with the kind of violence that doesn't come from nowhere. By morning, the neighbors grew uneasy. One recalled hearing muffled noises. Another swore they heard the faint drag of something heavy. But in apartment blocks, noise is background static. You filter out, until silence itself becomes suspicious. When Morgan was found, the room told the story before anyone could. He had fought desperately, but the fight had ended in silence. The scene was wrong in every way. A grown man brought down not by some hulking menace, but by a baby-faced stranger whose very appearance mocked the horror of what he'd done. The first disturbance wasn't just the act of violence itself. It was a realization that evil didn't look the way you expected. Evil didn't always carry scars, tattoos, or hard stares. Sometimes it carried acne and an awkward smile. Sometimes it looked like a kid who should have been worrying about his first real job, not following strangers into the night. And from that moment on, the city would never be able to look at innocence the same way again. The story could have been straightforward. A man dead, an intruder responsible. But Sydney didn't get simplicity, it got a riddle. When investigators pieced together the hours before Morgan's death, contradictions began piling up like bad debts. The CCTV trail showed Jack Kelsall following Morgan, but his movements before and after looked strange. Detours that didn't make sense, pauses on street corners where he lingered as if listening to voices no one else could hear. He wasn't just stalking. He was circling, rehearsing, like an actor waiting for his cue. Inside Morgan's apartment, the crime scene was a contradiction of its own. The violence was frenzied, yes, but it wasn't chaotic in the way you'd expect from a panicked teenager. Something suggested control. The way certain objects were untouched, the almost ritualistic way Morgan's body had been left. It felt staged, not by a professional, but by someone who wanted to be seen as one. That diary page, discovered later, only deepened the sense that this wasn't just violence but performance. Then there were the stories people began telling about Jack. He wasn't a stranger to everyone. Locals in Neutral Bay had seen him wandering the streets at odd hours, his face boyish but his stare unsettling. Some swore he spoke to himself in half-sentences, that he hung around bars but never quite belonged, a drifter without the courage to drift too far. And yet, when questioned, he insisted on his innocence with a kind of calm that didn't fit. It wasn't the panicked denial of someone cornered. It was a quiet, eerie confidence, as though he couldn't understand why anyone would doubt him. Detectives walked away from interviews unsettled, their notes filled with phrases like detached affect, no remorse, possible delusions. The public, hungry for a narrative, turned the case into folklore. Some painted Jack as a cold-blooded predator, calculating beyond his years. Others whisper about mental illness, about a boy abandoned by society, about hallucinations and compulsions no one had caught in time. And then there were conspiracy-minded, who swore Morgan's death wasn't random at all, but connected to something larger. Debts, secrets, maybe even shadowy networks. The mystery was no longer what happened. It was why. Why would an 18-year-old kid follow a stranger home and commit such violence? Why was the scene both frantic and deliberate? Why did he seem to melt in and out of suspicion, as though his face itself betrayed logic? It was as if every answer only fractured the case further, creating more jagged edges than smooth resolutions. And behind it all was that one haunting paradox. How could someone so young, so outwardly harmless, embody such darkness? The city waited for clarity. What it got instead was a spiral. The investigation was a clash between facts that screamed and motives that whispered. Detectives had Jack Kelsall on their sights almost immediately. CCTV placed him on Morgan's trail, DNA matched traces found in the apartment, and witnesses remembered his eerie late-night wanderings. The evidence wasn't thin, it was suffocating. Yet the story didn't line up neatly, and that was the problem. Jack's interviews were the stuff of nightmares. He didn't sweat, didn't stumble, didn't even act like a cornered teenager. Instead, he talked in spirals, half-truths tangled with deflections. Sometimes he claimed he barely knew Morgan. Other times he insisted he had been invited in, like an honored guest. Detectives described him as calm to the point of alien, as though he didn't grasp the gravity of the situation. It wasn't bravado. It was detachment, a kind of vacancy that chilled seasoned officers. Theories bloomed, each darker than the last. Some believed Jack was a budding predator, testing himself the way a child tests fire, curious to see how far he could go before getting burned. The precision of the attack, the eerie control, the lack of remorse, it all pointed to something far beyond teenage recklessness. This wasn't an accident. It was initiation. Others leaned toward a psychological explanation. Jack had a history of erratic behavior, whispers of paranoia, mutterings about voices. Neighbors claimed he drifted through streets like a ghost, speaking in half-thoughts to no one. Was he consumed by untreated illness, a brain-spinning conspiracies, until Morgan became a target not a choice but a delusion? If so, was this murder or a symptom ignored until erupted? And then there were the outsiders, the ones who never accept the official story. They painted Morgan as not just a victim, but as a man tangled in debts or secrets, someone who might have crossed paths with danger before that night. In their eyes, Jack wasn't a mastermind, he was a puppet, a disposable front for something far larger. It was a theory without much evidence. But like all conspiracies, it thrived in the gaps where facts refused to settle. The investigation sifted through these narratives, balancing hard evidence against psychological profiles, science against speculation. Prosecutors leaned on the tangible, DNA, CCTV, Jack's presence in the apartment. But beneath the surface, investigators admitted to themselves something they never put in their reports. They couldn't figure Jack out. He didn't fit the mold of a cold-blooded killer, nor of a panic youth. He was something else, a void that stared back when you try to label it. And in that void, Sydney found itself staring too long, too hard, until the question became unbearable. Was Jack a monster in disguise, or a broken boy the city failed to notice until it was too late? Trials are supposed to bring order. Evidence presented. Witnesses sworn. The machinery of justice grinding toward clarity. But the trial of Jack Kelsall was less a march toward resolution, and more a descent into theater, where reality warped under the heat of scrutiny. The turning point came not from some smoking gun revelation, but from the way Jack carried himself in court, seated at the defense table. His face looked absurdly young against the polished wood and heavy robes of the courtroom. Reporters whispered about how he could have passed for a high school student sitting through detention, rather than a man accused of tearing another human being's life apart. That contrast became a grotesque kind of spectacle. Innocence painted over horror, the baby face framed by the unblinking cameras. Witnesses testified to his oddness, how he wandered the streets, how he muttered to himself, how he seemed both present and absent at once. The prosecution painted him as a predator, calculating despite his age. The defense leaned hard into mental illness, pointing to a fractured psyche, untreated delusions, a boy who slipped through the cracks of care. Then came the twist. Jack, against all advice, insisted on addressing the court. His words weren't a confession, not even a plea for understanding. They were fragments, surreal and jagged. He spoke of being pulled toward Morgan, of shadows that don't belong, of feeling like he was chosen for something terrible. The courtroom froze. Some thought it was manipulation, a performance crafted to paint him as insane. Others swore the emptiness in his voice was too genuine, too unnerving to fake. This was the breakdown, not of the case itself, but certainty. The prosecution still had DNA, CCTV, a crime scene drenched in struggle. But the narrative fractured. Was Jack a cunning killer hiding behind youthful features, or a deeply unstable young man spiraling into hallucination? Jurors exchanged nervous glances. Reporters scribbled frantically, and the public clung to their own biases, half demanding retribution, half whispering about failure of mental health systems. The moment seared itself into Sydney's collective psyche, a boyish face speaking in riddles about shadows and fate, a dead man's family weeping silently, and a city force confronted truth it didn't want to admit, that evil doesn't always arrive with horns and menace. Sometimes it wears the face of someone who should still be worrying about exams. The trial no longer felt like justice. It felt like staring into a cracked mirror, unsure if what you were seeing was human, broken, or something in between. The verdict came down like a hammer: guilty. Jack Kelsall was sentenced to decades behind bars for the killing of Morgan Huxley. On paper, it was resolution. The law had spoken. The system had done its job. Morgan's family wept. Sydney exhaled. Headlines declared justice. But beneath the neatness of the outcome, the questions refused to die. Because here's the thing, a guilty verdict doesn't solve the riddle of why. The prosecution told a story of cold-blooded calculation. An 18-year-old who followed a stranger home, entered his apartment, and struck with merciless precision. Their version was simple. Beneath that baby face lurked a predator. But the defense had planted seeds that never stopped growing. What if Jack was sick? Truly sick, trapped in a mind that whispered commands he couldn't escape? Did prison bars cure delusions or just cage them? And then there was the eerie detail people kept returning to. The way Jack spoke about being pulled, as though something external, invisible had guided him. Madness? Manipulation? Or the raw truth of someone who lived more in hallucination than reality? That line between the supernatural and the psychological blurred in uncomfortable ways, leaving some to wonder if the city had locked away not a killer, but a symptom. Morgan's death, too, raised questions. Why him? Why that night? There was no evidence of prior connection, no feud, no reason. Randomness is the cruelest explanation, but it was the one that stuck. A man came home from a bar, a boy followed, and fate twisted into horror. The sheer senselessness of it became its own torment. And then, the diary page. Never officially tied to Jack, never entered as evidence, but always hovering in the margins. Who wrote it? Was it his? A glimpse into compulsion? Or was it an unrelated artifact? A distraction mistaken for prophecy? Investigators shrugged it off. The public did not. That single sentence. I didn't mean to do it, but once I started, I couldn't stop. Haunted the case like a ghost that refused to leave. The resolution was tidy on paper, but jagged in memory. Jack was behind bars. Morgan was gone. Yet Sydney was left with a wound that wouldn't close. A story that seemed less about one man's guilt and more about the disturbing possibility that anyone could wear a face of innocence while harboring something unspeakable inside. So yes, there was justice, but there was no peace. The city tried to move on, but the story of the baby-faced killer refused to fade. It wasn't just another headline crime. It burrowed into Sydney's cultural memory like a splinter. People in Neutral Bay locked their doors a little tighter. Bars checked IDs with renewed suspicion. And young men with soft features found themselves unfairly measured against a ghost. Morgan Huxley's family carried the grief like a scar. Friends described the years after as muted, as though laughter came slower, conversations shorter. The absence of one man had left a crater that refused to be filled. His name became shorthand for a warning. Trust can kill you. Parents whispered to their kids, not to scare them, but because they couldn't shake the fear themselves. Jack Kelsall's name, meanwhile, took on a mythology of its own. Some saw him as a monster, proof that evil doesn't wait for age. Others painted him as a casualty of neglect, a boy unraveling while society looked the other way. His face circulated in newspapers, his youth clashing grotesquely with captions that screamed words like killer and predator. That contradiction became the hook, the thing people couldn't stop talking about. How someone who looked like a schoolboy could hold a knife steady. The legal system, bruised by public outcry, didn't emerge unscathed either. Commentators asked uncomfortable questions. How had Jack slipped through unnoticed, despite his erratic behavior? Should his trial have leaned harder into mental health? Could anything have prevented Morgan's death? No clear answers came, only more shadows. In the years that followed, the story bled into pop culture. True crime podcasts dissected it. Crime writers borrowed from it. And strangers online debated endlessly whether Jack was evil or ill. The nickname Babyface Killer stuck, as grotesque nicknames always do, branding him forever, reducing a complex human tragedy into a macabre soundbite. And yet, the case left something more enduring, more corrosive, a distrust of appearances. Before, innocence was a face, a tone, a softness that reassured. After Morgan's death, Sydney learned that appearances lie, that a smile can hide violence, that a boyish face can mask hunger. And once you learn that lesson, you never see people the same way again. The legacy wasn't just about one man gone, one man imprisoned. It was about a city robbed of its illusions. A city forced to confront the fact that danger doesn't always look dangerous, that sometimes it looks like a kid leaning on a lamppost, waiting for the bus, and smiling as you walk past. The jury took just 3 hours to reach their decision. On December 17th, 2014, they returned to the courtroom, faces drawn with the weight of what they had heard. The foreperson stood and, with a steady voice, delivered the verdict, guilty of murder. Jack Kelsall showed no flicker of remorse. He stood stiff, hands clasped in front of him, as if the words had no meaning. But in the gallery, Morgan Huxley's family wept openly. Their son, their brother. The young man who had once filled rooms with laughter had been reduced to a story of brutality and loss. Justice, in its cold and imperfect way, had been served, but it would never bring Morgan back. When sentencing day arrived in February 2015, the courtroom again filled with reporters, police officers, family members, and the public. The judge, Justice Robert Hume, did not hold back in his words. He called the murder brutal, callous, and cowardly, describing how Morgan's final moments were marked by terror and pain. For the murder of Morgan Huxley, Jack Kelsall was sentenced to a maximum of 40 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 30 years. This meant he would be eligible for release in the 2040s, a date that felt impossibly distant to most, yet terrifyingly real to those who feared the possibility of his freedom. Kelsall remained expressionless as the sentence was read, his cold demeanor reinforcing the chilling image that had haunted the trial from the beginning. The baby-faced killer blank detached, as if life and death carried no weight. For Morgan Huxley's family, the verdict and sentencing brought a measure of closure, but never peace. His parents spoke of an unbearable emptiness, of birthdays and Christmases forever scarred by the absence of their son. Morgan had been the youngest in his family, the one who always brought warmth into a room. Now, his name was bound forever to a night of violence. The media, too, left its mark. For months, headlines replayed the narrative. The baby-faced killer, a nickname that seemed almost surreal in its contrast. The press fixated on Kelsall's boyish looks, his soft features, and how those masked the darkness beneath. For the public, it became a story of trust betrayed, how someone so young, so seemingly unthreatening, could commit an act of such senseless brutality. In Sydney's North Shore, the case lingered like a shadow. For those who had frequented the Oaks Hotel, where Morgan had spent his final night, the memory of his last carefree hours never faded. Patrons recalled the laughter, the drinks, the ordinary joy, followed by the horror that unfolded just streets away. For Morgan's friends, the lesson was bitter and cruel. Safety was fragile, trust could be fatal, and danger could wear the face of innocence. Over time, the story of Morgan Huxley became more than a crime report. It became a cautionary tale. Podcasts, documentaries, and news specials revisited the case, dissecting the psychology of Kelsall, the investigation that caught him, and the randomness of Morgan's fate. The tragedy underscored something chilling. Evil often hides in plain sight. It does not always announce itself with menace. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it looks harmless, sometimes it wears the face of a boy. For the Huxley family, however, Morgan was not defined by the brutality of his death. They remembered him for his kindness, his humor, and his dreams of the future. They worked to keep his memory alive not as a victim, but as a son, brother, and friend who had been loved deeply. And for Australia, the case left a haunting reminder that even in the safest neighborhoods, darkness can strike, leaving scars that last for generations. Evil rarely looks the way we expect. It doesn't always come with scars or a scowl or the face of a monster. Sometimes it wears the soft features of youth. Sometimes it looks like the boy next door. Morgan Huxley's story is one of life interrupted. A young man walking home after a night out with friends, unaware that fate had already marked him. His killer was not a shadow lurking in the dark alleyways of Sydney, but a stranger with an innocent smile, carried within him a darkness no one could see. The case became more than a tragedy. It became a warning, a reminder that trust can be misplaced, that safety can dissolve in an instant, and that the monsters we fear may not always be the ones we recognize. For Morgan's family, justice brought a sentence, but no verdict, no prison term can ever fill the space he left behind. Their grief is a life sentence of its own. And for us, the audience, the story lingers, because Morgan's death forces us to look at the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the most terrifying killers are not the ones who look like villains. Sometimes, they are the ones who look like children, the baby-face killer. The name lives on, not as a curiosity, but as a chilling contradiction, an echo of a night when innocence masked horror and a life full of promise was stolen in the silence of a Sydney bedroom. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.